Hi, good morning everybody. So great to be with you all on this, what is a very blue and sunny day. However, this time last year, if you remember, we were just heading into the winter storms, and certainly parts of Doncaster and the Midlands were well and truly underwater. So what I wanted to do today was just take some time to go through what I consider to be the top 3 things that we should all be thinking about as we do go into the winter storms, to make sure that you are all on the front foot and not on the back foot. Because while COVID has been all-consuming this year, actually the sleeping giant in all of our worlds are climate, and certainly here in the UK, flood risk. So if we could just bring up the slides, please. Thank you. So what I thought I'd start with is actually a quick look back on what this year has held for me. I'm head of catastrophe resilience at Marsh, and so my world every day has been a world of dealing with flood and climate related issues. And before I get into that forward look, I wanted to look back and just reflect on where we were back in January with the production of the World Economic Forum report that solidly put flood and climate more widely as the top 5 issues that were concerning to all of us. And so that started the year off very much with flood and climate in the spotlight. And what we started to see in January of this year were renewal challenges. In my job, I'm helping businesses, small and large, with their renewals and how they move through that if they do have flood risk. And while the insurance market has been transitioning, we've seen flood risk and climate risk increasingly coming into the spotlight as a reason for insurers to take a much firmer view on that renewal basis. So there's been a number of motivations for why businesses have had to start thinking about this. Ethically, yes, because of governance, yes. Things like the Bank of England stress tests, because of their renewals, yes. Because they are curators of an estate of assets, yes. All of those reasons have meant that this has been very much in the spotlight. So let's just move on to February. And what we saw then was it rubber hits the road, Chiara and Dennis. And that was very disruptive for many businesses, more than 82,000 claims all being coped with as COVID beckoned. And one thing that you may be aware of, or you may not, is that in parallel, the Code of Practice for Flood Resilience was launched at Westminster. And I'm proud to be one of the team who produced that code over the last 3 years. And what that's really done for us as a risk management community is it's meant that we have now got a very good framework and structured set of guidance for how we as businesses can deal with flood. And that's absolutely critical because, as I'll be talking about, it gives us standards, it gives us structure. And yes, we've launched the Code of Practice, which says if you're a homeowner, what should you do? If you're a business, what should you do? What does good look like? But it's also given us the tools to now start thinking about other things like flood certification, scoring flood risk at given locations in a way that we haven't been able to before. So that was just February. So a lot had happened. And then, of course, COVID hit. For me, that didn't stop flooding. It didn't stop the need to respond and recover. Instead, it just caused us to pivot in terms of how we were helping people. Then, of course, we come into April and other things are beginning to happen. We continue to have lots of activity around flooding, and we then started giving briefings. People started to get fatigue from COVID, and their minds then came back to the other risks that they were facing. And so, yes, we did a lot of briefings on flooding, talking about the code, helping people to start thinking about how they could recover resiliently from floods. And then moving on again into June, we start to see continued need to do flood surveys. I'm having to now adapt and begin doing remote surveys of sites where we would perhaps have our experts sitting at our desks, but members of the company actually going around the site and looking and seeing and being our eyes and ears on the ground. Very important to be able to continue doing all of that. And then July hits. This was the first time for Airmic that we had done a specifically focused piece on flood risk and resilience. And I did it with one of my favourite people in the whole world, Ian Gibbs. He's a loss adjuster from Sedgwick. He sits on the flood resilience roundtable with me. And during that briefing, we gave some advice on how to recover resiliently and also how to plan and ensure that you as a business are looking at flood in a resilient, through a resilient prism. Then August comes and we start to see the next phase of flooding, the summer floods. And lo and behold, me at home, I flood. And so rubber hits the road again, and I'm the one who's now coping with flooding in my home and having to deal with that. And that gave me a very personal and close-up view of just how important my job is to make sure that people are helped and they have a good knowledge and framework for how to deal with this. Moving on again into September, climate is all consuming. Back in August, I started doing some big projects on climate ahead of the Bank of England stress tests that are coming next year. And if you haven't heard about those yet, you will begin to, because the banking sector is very much driving on the front foot of the financial consequences of climate and flooding. However, what we always see is the financial sector may lead, but then it then comes through to affect other businesses. And I'll be talking about that today, because operationally, we all have to have a plan and we all have to know how we're going to manage that. So Airmic Fest was September, and here we find ourselves October moving into November with this briefing. So for me, that's a bit of a recap of a very whirlwind year, up and down, so many things happening to do with flooding. But looking forwards, what I wanted to do today was give you some solid actions that as risk managers, risk officers, as boards, that you should be considering, very practical things that you can do today. And I do want to challenge you. So one thing we're going to be doing is a bit of fun later. It's going to be a spot the difference, where I'd like you all to have your chat windows open, because I'm going to see just how much you can pick up about what resilient and what good looks like when it comes to flood. So please just have your chat window open as we get cracking. So when I sat and thought about what my top 3 things were to be thinking about, these were the ones that absolutely came front stage and centre for me. Flood emergency response plans. Have you got one? If you have got one, have you exercised it? We're all sitting here, a lot of us working from home. COVID's dictating how we're managing our day-to-day lives. Flooding doesn't care. Flooding is going to happen and it's going to affect your business. It's going to affect your premises irrespective. It just means that we've got to be clever about how we as managers and how we as leaders ensure that it doesn't ruin us and it doesn't affect us for the next year. I always say that a good flood emergency response plan means that if you do flood, you flood on a Friday, but you're back up and running on a Monday. That's what good looks like. And I'll be speaking a bit more about how we accomplish that. The second thing I thought you'd all want to hear more about is renewals. I do work for Marsh. I do work through the renewal process with hundreds of businesses. And therefore, it's really important, given that the market is changing, that you understand some of the things that I'm seeing and you take appropriate action if you have flood risk. And then the third one that I will be speaking about is climate. It's gone a little bit on the, not so much in the headlines recently, but believe me, there's so much going on in the background. We're heavily involved in stress testing. There's new standards that are coming. The government is putting out calls to have commentary on things like TCFD reporting. You may or may not have even heard of some of these new acronyms like TCFD and ESG. And sorry if I'm going to be reinventing the wheel for a few of you, because you've heard about it all already. But my feedback has been that it's worthwhile us just taking a few minutes to lay some foundations so you know what that's all about. Okay, so flood emergency response plans. James and I, we work in crisis management, and this is one of the mainstays of how we ensure that we are ready and that our clients and businesses are ready. So with flood emergency response plans are a little different to a general crisis plan because they dictate how you as a business are going to be responding. And there's 2 key elements to that. There is what you do in terms of the physical response, i.e. how do you protect your building? Do you put flood doors in place? Do you have a strategy where you put a temporary flood barrier around it? But in parallel with that physical response, there's actually the people element. And do you have a structured command and control process? Do you have people who are trained, people who are experienced, people who are on 24/7 call monitoring, ready for the next flood event? In my job, I'm on 24/7 call because I run Flood Re's nationwide response service. And so I'm constantly, this morning, every day, getting feeds to know exactly where we are as a country. And what good looks like is being able to have that similar finger on the pulse to know when something's coming, because as we all know, time is critical. But the reason why this kind of flood emergency response plan can now be shaped in a very expert manner is partly because we have a code of practice that we can adhere to. So when I'm talking about what good looks like in how you physically manage your response, we can defer to the code. I'll talk a bit more about the code in a minute, but what it's done is it's laid out a very clear set of guidelines for how we manage flooding and how we implement measures to make sure that it's going to work. Because everybody knows that a piece of paper isn't worth anything until you see it tested and you see it working in practice. And by having the code, it means that we're much more confident that the way in which we put measures in place to manage flood, be it doors, be it temporary flood barriers, be it non-return air bricks, be it sump pumps, all of those things together are going to make up a workable solution that hopefully will never have to be used. But the risk modelling tells us it may, and indeed with climate, it may have to be used more and more and more frequently. So in my world, I follow a very simple 5-step process, and whether it's a big business or a small business, whether it's a government, whether it's a non-profit, it doesn't matter, whether it's a home, this is a true approach which seems to work very well for everyone. And the flood emergency response plan sits solidly at step 3, where we're beginning to implement measures. But typically, before I've got that flood emergency response plan, so that I know that it's covering exactly the right things and that the business is protected in the right way, you may have had to go through step 1 and step 2, where for step 1 you diagnose which of your assets even have risk. You know, have you got 1? Have you got 10? You know, you need to know which ones are your risky ones. Once you know that, why are they risky? And that's where we would do our surveys. Go out, flood resilience surveyors. I've done my training. I'm a qualified BRE, flood resilience surveyor. We go out, we look, and we assess why you're risky and then what you should do about it. Then step 3, put the measures in place to ensure that you are confident that you have a strategy to respond. Part of that may be physical measures, part of that may be your command and control, but both of them come together in your flood emergency response plan. So that is the key step 3 that I'm going to be talking a bit more about now. So what does a good flood emergency response plan look like? So what we know is, following the normal crisis management sequence, there are 3 key steps. And these should be really familiar to you. It's just that they've got this flooding focus. So monitoring, as I've mentioned, I'm on 24/7 call. I wonder how many of you have an app on your phone which is monitoring flooding at your most vulnerable premises. If you don't have it, you should give us a shout because we can tell you how to get it. Sometimes people don't trust that the ways that we as a country are monitoring, which is through Environment Agency, Natural Resource Wales, SEPA, they all have methods. Some people don't trust that they're quite on point enough, and they install their own monitoring devices in and around their own facilities. Whatever you do, you need to have this. And so I'd encourage all of you to make sure you've got that, or the lead of your flood emergency response team, we call them a flood response officer, has that. So let's say that's in place and we're all monitoring and an event was to unfold. You'd already have done the assessment of what the response should look like. You'll have put measures in place, hopefully, and so you'll know what your strategy is. So that response will be well rehearsed, it will be exercised, and it will hopefully have a process where you trigger the response is about to happen. If necessary, you put yourselves on standby or you escalate to immediate action, and then you'll deploy whichever strategies you have. And in my world, I'll deal with all kinds of different strategies. Some of them are what I call resistance, where you hold back the water. Some of them are what I call recoverability, where people have no choice but to allow the water to enter but quickly leave. Whichever that is, that response is critical, because we know the difference between being able to be back in your business in 3 days versus 9 or 12 months. And obviously, we're always aiming for you to be in there quicker. And then recovery. In an ideal world, your recovery will be really quick, and we walk you through a step-by-step process. Hopefully your plans similarly have that element, which prioritises all the different steps, both in terms of your buildings, but also very much in terms of your critical machinery, your workforce. And of course, with COVID, that has a slightly different spin. So one of the things that I do with James is we do exercises, and we do flood specific exercises. And within that, we've had to pivot and be able to do that for COVID, and really encourage people to work through their plans and say, how should it be different? And I wonder if how many of you that we have in the audience today have had an opportunity to kick the tyres, or maybe, you know, given it's the 3rd of November, maybe you should. If you are totally happy with doing that, cool. If you'd like to shoot us a line and get some insights from us, that's cool too. I'll put my flood resilience website up at the end. Okay, so in terms of flood emergency response, I mentioned a couple of key words. The 3 R's are not reading, writing and arithmetic. They're actually resilience, resistance and recoverability. And so if you could just be at the ready to enter into your chat window, what I wanted to do was just take a couple of minutes to do a spot the difference, where we will all have a chance to think about what resistance and recoverability measures are. These are what underpin the code of practice. And as I mentioned, resistance are measures that hold back the water. The things that you'll be familiar with, their walls, their doors, that kind of resistance. But recoverability is very much the new philosophy of living with water. In some places, it's just not going to be possible to hold back the water. With climate change, levels are rising, and something that may today have a risk of 20 centimetres of flooding may in future have a risk of 60 centimetres of flooding. And there's only certain tolerances that buildings can cope with. If water goes above the design tolerance, you have to let it in, otherwise your building becomes structurally unsound. And so we're always working through that in our minds of what is practical, what is safe. And so recoverability are other measures, which means you can be flooded on a Friday and back up and running on a Monday. Some examples might include sump pumps to help whisk the water away, tanking out a building. I know our CEO, Chris Lay at Marsh, told me he's tanked out his basement at home. Very clever. Make sure that you don't then have it all seeping into the brickwork and the plasterboard. Things like plasterboard, which is water resistant. Things like having kitchens that can be hosed down. Flooring that can similarly be hosed down and disinfected. But I'm kind of giving away some of the answers here, because I'm just going to click on to our spot the difference. So this is a hypothetical company, and what you can see here are 2 different views. The view on the left, which is before resilience has been installed, and then the view on the right, which is after. And I'm going to shut up for a second and just let you peer in and have a look. And I'd be so grateful if in the chat window you type some of the differences that you can see. Thanks, James. You've got us started. Flood wall. I should also actually ask you to type in whether it's resistance or whether it's recoverability. So James, is that one resistance or recoverability? Oh, great. Good. We've got things coming. Fantastic. Matt. Oh, and Tim, right, door guard. I've got to be able to scroll now. Right, so flood meter and level. Matt Goldsmith, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to that one. Tim, door guard. So that's a resistance measure. Amanda, very good, thank you. Flooring has changed. That's a recoverability measure, because if the water does come in, you want to have flooring like tiling that can be just washed down. Flood walls, that's the tanking, very good. Also door barriers, very good, different flooring. Floor drain, very good, that's a sump pump, that's going to be able to whisk the water away quickly. Bunded doorways, yeah, those are often removable flood barriers, again, resistance. Ring fenced wall resistance. Oh yes, stock raised off the floor. Excellent. That's one of the key things that is such an easy step. You imagine you lift all of your key stock up higher, and then you're not going to be losing it. Very good. I mean, we've got lots of things in there. One I want to come back to, which was right at the start, which came from Matt Goldsmith, I think it was there's a white pole that sits on the outside of the building in the after. That's a slightly cheeky one that we've put in there, because that is a new kind of flood resilience insurance solution, which is provided by a company called Flood Flash, and it's a parametric flood insurance cover that we at Marsh are providing. And I will be talking a bit more about that in the next section, but it's an instant payout flood cover, where a lot of businesses who can't get traditional cover are able to get this sort of cover, and it literally pays out within 24 hours without any kind of requirement for loss adjusting. So given the changing insurance market, it's something that businesses are much more taking advantage of this year. Right, coming back to my list. Oh, Matt's saying he's cheated because he's seen the Spot the Difference before. Thanks for being honest there, Matt. Okay. One thing I'm not sure whether people have spotted, on the right-hand side, there are air bricks which have gone from being white to being blue. The reason why they've changed colour is that one of the things people forget is that water seeps through very small cracks as well as very big ones, and they may put a big door in place, but then they forget that all the water's coming through the air brick as a constant flow, and it fills up just the same. I'm just checking to see whether anyone's spotted electrics. So one thing that is a little tiny, because it's on the wall inside, is the movement of the electrical sockets up higher. Because one thing we know is that electrics and water don't mix well, and so many businesses lose power because they haven't raised up their electrics. Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Bruce. You've picked up the air bricks there. I think we've got R8. Let me just recap through them if I get them pulled up on screen here. Listen, I hope you found that fun and interesting, because to me, this is the whole way that we need to start seeing our homes, and we need to start seeing our businesses with this mindset of resilience, and a mindset that we can't always hold the water back, but sometimes we've got to think about living with water. And I'd kind of encourage all of you to, next time you go to the office, if you think there's any risk of flooding, or even next time you're at home, I certainly now think about my home slightly differently. I had a flooding due to a blocked sewer further down my street, and I now know exactly where all my drains are, exactly where my elevations are, and exactly how that water now flows around my property. But perhaps I didn't know that to such a great degree, and I even work in this. So yeah, eyes open, hopefully, having done this exercise. But thank you all very much. Really appreciate you jumping in and taking part. So before I move on, hopefully that section 1 has made you have some thoughts around flood emergency response plans, the incorporation of resilience into your mindset and into how you may be planning. If you do want to do some exercising, anything like that, reach out to me and James. It's what we do all the time. Be happy to offer you some guidance. Now, the other thing that I thought you may want to have a think about was renewals, because at the moment, like I mentioned, it's tricky out there. And insurers, because of the changing market, have very much got a focus on flood. And if there is a risk of flood for any of your assets, they will be being very challenging. And it's my job to help Number one, ensure we have a level playing field where everybody knows the risk. And if you have done good work, where you do have a flood plan, you have done measures, that's recognised. Because it isn't always the case that the hazard is the truth. I often talk about what I call net risk, not gross risk. I talk about net risk because it's risk and resilience. Yes, you may have a flood risk at your site, but if you've managed that well and you've installed resilience measures, then you're actually a safe bet for an insurer. So you'll all get the slides afterwards, and I'll let you read down the full list of insurer requirements later. But like I mentioned, it's my job to level the playing field and ensure that you understand how insurers see you and that you are ready to respond. And a key element of that, of course, is the flood emergency response plan. But beyond that, one thing that people want to see is a very tight understanding of risk and ownership of risk. And also the idea that these kind of risks are exercised, because a plan on a piece of paper is no use whatsoever if it hasn't been tested. So through my work with Flood Re and with the UK government's Flood Resilience Roundtable, we've launched the code. That's really helpful because it now gives everybody the same framework to judge what good and bad looks like. We also have done a lot of work to make sure that we can offer guidance on the right kind of measures. It doesn't always have to be a wall. It can be other things that are appropriate to a site. And you've done some of those in the Spot the Difference. And it's been part of my job to ensure that insurers are on that journey with us. As I mentioned before, we're now switched focus from just from the code towards flood certificates and scores. But that's a while away. So what you can see here is a list of things that insurers would wish to know about. And as you're coming into your renewal, I'd encourage you to make sure that your broker, if you have one, or yourselves, if you're doing it directly, have all of these kind of things talked about and covered off. And what I'd say is that it does work when you put together a good case for your flood resilience. We have been through some very tough renewals so far this year. Here are a few stories that we've had. We've been really busy over the summer doing surveys for one large builders merchants who had more than 30 sites which were identified as having extreme flood risk. And so, yes, through COVID, we've done remote surveys and we've been around all of these sites. And it's had a double win, really, because while we're sitting at our desks and representatives of the company are out there being our eyes and ears, yes, we've gathered the data that we needed to do the flood survey and provide the recommendations. But at the same time, those people who've been out walking the site have had their eyes opened and they've, in a way, become flood experts in their own right through us. And so they've then very happily morphed into the role of being the flood response officer. So it's really been a bit of a win-win. But what I'd say is that once we start seeing that kind of action within a company, insurers have been much kinder around excesses and actual provision of cover, because we are seeing a lot of very big excesses imposed for flood. We're also seeing flat bang denial of flood insurance, which is part of the reason why we've started working with new parametric solutions, because if people can't get traditional cover, what are they going to be doing instead? We've also seen some very tough limits on the amount of cover. One particular case I've been working with recently is a car dealership where they had a claim because of a flood in February, and they've struggled to get cover. And yet, without being able to get insurance cover, the people who then provide the credit to be able to support the purchase of the cars that sit on the forecourts don't have confidence that they're a good bet. And so it affects the whole business unless you can demonstrate that you've got a good flood emergency response. Again, I'll leave you to read through some of these case studies, but this is just three of like many, many different ones that we've been working on. And again, if this is something where perhaps you are worried it's coming, one thing I'd suggest is don't sit on your laurels. Start early. we always start our discussions, if there's any hint of flood, at least 6 months before the renewal. That gives us a chance to level the playing field, make sure that any surveys to be done, that should be done, are done, and we can really begin putting the right kind of measures in place. Much better that than going through a whole bunch of quotes and then finding you've not got cover, you've got, you know, absolutely nothing on the table and no options. It's one of those things where being on the front foot means everything. One thing that we've realised as well is that sometimes people have flood risk, but they may not know it. And the first time they hear is with the changing market, when the insurer tells them. Again, that's a back foot situation, don't like that. So we provide no-cost flood screenings where we'll just take a set of locations and run it through our screening tool, and then at least you know whether you've got extreme river flood risk, in which case, yes, start thinking about how you're going to develop some resilience actions around that. And then point 3, I'm by nature quite an open-minded person. I like to look at things from many different directions, and insurance is one element of this, because one of the things that we see is that with the large excesses, with the limits of cover, with all of that, there are new solutions coming and being available to you as businesses that you may not have heard about. And the parametric flood insurance is a classic example of this. It's available for individual assets. There's also a solution which is available for more of a portfolio basis. And the company that we do that with is called Flood Flash. Okay. So we've talked about flood emergency response, we've talked about resilience, we've talked about renewals, and that's all very much been with a flood focus. However, I would also say in parallel in my world, climate is another theme that is front stage and centre. And so I did want to leave you all with a few thoughts on how you are going to begin managing your climate risk. So climate's really come into the spotlight in the last couple of years, not necessarily because of the risk it poses today, but more because of how companies are being perceived by investors, and also because of the need to manage the financial downside of climate in future. And so with these things combined, my world has become a world of 2 new acronyms, ESG and TCFD. So sorry if you've already been doing loads of work on ESG and I'm teaching you to suck eggs, but I did want to make sure that everybody was fully comfortable with these 3 different pillars that we're now having to build into our ERM world. And for me, my part of it is very much in the environmental pillar. I have colleagues who are specialists in the social and the governance element, but today I'm just going to focus on the environmental piece. So in my world of environmental, there's the piece that I've really touched on in detail here, which is physical risk. And that's very much linked into things like flood, but also in the UK, subsidence. So subsidence risk is one of the other ones that's very much in the spotlight when it comes to climate. And there's the physical element, but then there's also what we call the transition element, which is how this need to adapt to climate affects not just the physical asset, but the way in which a business operates. I'll come on to that in a minute. So I've got that physical climate related piece, but of course in the E, you've also got to think about all those other sustainability factors. And I've been very privileged to, for the last few years, be working closely with BRE, the Buildings Research Establishment. And they, for one, have been very much championing testing, knowledge, good practice around how businesses do it operationally in practice and not in theory. So hopefully you've all been thinking about your ESG strategy. Hopefully you've all got statements about it in your annual reports. Hopefully you've all got a roadmap for what you're going to do this year, in 2021, and then in 2022. Because what we do know is that the government is beginning to put the pressure on for TCFD. And TCFD is Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure. The banks and financial institutions are already there. They're beginning to need to report on this. And this is their financial provisioning You can see this come to life with things like the Bank of England stress tests, which are asking banks to run scenario tests for different RCP scenarios. And those RCPs are different relative concentration pathways of carbon going forwards to both very different levels of potential carbon net zero going forward, and the timescale with which we can achieve that. So every day my world is a world of helping manage flood, but also helping quantify this climate risk financially. And what I mentioned was the idea of both physical and transition risks. And we have to do both, because we aren't just about the physical assets, but also about how it affects you as a business, whether it's your supply chain, whether it's just your customer base, all of the different things that can affect the revenues that you're going to have and the attractiveness of your products going forward. So I did want to make sure that I had mentioned both of those, and I'd alerted you to the fact that there needs to be a roadmap. Hopefully as part of your risk management you have this. But one of the things that we've been doing is working Esg and Tcfd into the wider ERM framework, because they are important new topics, and it's not obvious necessarily how you're going to do that. There's loads of stuff that's been written, there's lots of different degrees of freedom that need to be built in, but let's just make it simple and actually get it into your ERM framework as new entries. And so that's what we've been busy doing and helping people with. So hopefully you've already got it, you've already got the roadmap, but if not, and you'd like to have a chat about any of this, do just give me a shout. So I'm just about to wrap. I wanted to go back and say any questions you've got on the things that we've spoken about today. If you'd like to learn more about flood and climate resilience, just hop on the website. I've tried to make it just really practical. It talks about the code of practice, you can read it. It talks about some case studies of other businesses who've had to be coping with this over the last year. I'm very motivated by helping businesses and helping people be safe and not have sleepless nights. When I flooded in August, it was pretty awful. And I just know that that kind of pain is 10 times worse if your business is jeopardized and your entire livelihood. So let's just say, go there, have a look. There's some really good stuff. There's a good video which we produced for Airmic Fest in September that I'm really proud of, because it's the first time we've modelled and shown the quantitative, like financial calculations of how much does resilience cost. If you do it, how much would you save if you had a loss? And it's a really nice little video right at the top. Anyways, do feel free to go and have a look at that. And on that note, let me just provide my contact details and say that I hope that this has been useful to you. I hope that you've got something meaningful out of the message, which is to look at your FERP, look at your renewal, and then begin thinking about how you're going to approach climate going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bev. Really appreciate that input there. I quite like the personal side of what you're able to bring there. I think there's nothing worse than having raw sewage come through your your house. I can't imagine how much stress that would have caused. I'm very conscious of time. We were running over a little bit prior to Bev starting her presentation. So what I'm going to do actually is skip my section and instead use the time that we've got now to have more of a Q&A on the presentation that we've just heard. So if you have any questions for Bev, or anything else that you want to sort of say around broader issues of resilience, which I'm happy to answer, then please put them in the Q&A box on the system. While you're doing that, though, all I'll do is I'll ask the first question, and I'm gonna tie sort of COVID into this conversation, as everybody seems to do at the moment. The question, Bev, is what do you think we can learn from our response to COVID so far in applying to a flooding scenario?
So I think many important things that we should be learning. Goodness, When you look at the importance of looking at different scenarios, thinking through where you are today versus where you need to be in a couple of months' time, the whole approach in terms of laying out a structured crisis response. One thing that I sort of have been hit with time and again is that flooding isn't just rivers. Flooding is surface water. I was flooded by surface water. I live on Hillside Road, for goodness sake. I mean, I bought my home, given what I do, in an area that was not meant to flood, but it can happen to any of us. Things like pumping stations. Recently, I've seen failure of pumping stations causing flooding in industrial estates where tens of businesses have been affected. You may not think it's going to be happening to you, but I think it's a mindset shift where you think it probably is going to happen to me and I should be ready anyway. And then if it doesn't, I've been lucky. And I think it's the same with COVID. I plan as though I'm going to, and me and my family are going to be affected. And then if we're not, we're lucky. But I plan for the worst, and then I'm pleasantly surprised when it doesn't happen. But planning. I can't say enough about planning. And then being trusting in your knowledge as a risk manager of how you think, what you think good looks like. With COVID, I think we've all had to look at the rules, but then in a way, because we work in this professionally, add our own element on top of that and how we're looking at managing it. It's the same with flooding. It's your businesses, and with climate, it's your businesses, and it's your responsibility to take ownership of that. It's my job to be a good guide and a good sounding board for you. Is that helpful, James?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Bev. And just to add to that, I think some of the experience that I have been involved in response to COVID, I think applies just the same to flooding and any other type of crisis event. I think that a lot of our business continuity arrangements pre-COVID were not sufficiently broad enough to cover the kind of risks that we're exposed to, the big mega type risks that COVID has proved that we need to be planning for. I don't think we're using enough data to underpin our planning and our stress testing, and I don't think we are challenging ourselves enough in the type of scenarios that we're testing our resilience arrangements against. So yeah, just to add to Bev's point there, there's a comment on the Q&A from Anthony about no mention of coastal erosion and rising sea levels. I think, Bev, that's definitely something that you're heavily involved in. I wonder whether you can say a few words about that.
Definitely. So yes, today I have really bigged up flood risk as we come into the winter storm season, because to me that is front of mind. I've also mentioned subsidence or subsidence. Coastal erosion risk and rising sea levels, permanent coastal inundation, is a deep worry for all of us. And you may be aware that in August, the government launched its Esg ERM, or Flood and Coastal Erosion Management strategy, where they're investing £1.2 billion in the next 4 years to help us better manage flood and coastal erosion. And I'm really proud that a year ago we started a project on alternative funding and financing to help people and coastal communities who do have coastal erosion risk and risk of permanent inundation begin planning for the future. Because as you may also know, it ain't easy getting insurance if you live in a coastal erosion zone. You can still get it for flood, but if your home may fall into the sea in a few years' time, there's a general misconception that you don't deserve to have any kind of protection and that you're just lucky to live at the coast. Believe me, there are many people who live at the coast who haven't got a second holiday home. They're just regular people doing their lives, and therefore why should they be denied things like insurance cover, and why should they be put at risk for their homes going forward with no way to support them? And so it's been our job to look at alternative funding and financing mechanisms. We're still very much on that journey, and if anybody wants to know more about the Esg ERM strategy, super happy to share. It's going to be evolving over the next the roadmap over the next 6 months, and then the works over the next 4 years. I can also see in that question things like CO2 emissions, all of those other bits and bobs. Again, I haven't really majored on that today, but that falls solidly into my E, out of the ESG. So if people again want to have a chat about that, just let me know.
Thanks, Bev. Got a question about organisations that are managing flood risk well. How do they set themselves apart from less well managed flood risk organisations when they're talking to their insurers?
So you saw my checklist of things that need to be presented as part of a renewal. The companies who manage it well have a very clear statement around their strategy, and they provide evidence the same way that you would need to do that to be eligible for credit or a loan. I mean, it's just a very simple display of information, and things like surveys are the truth. So when you put a survey in front of an insurer that's been done by a PFR qualified surveyor, and you provide them with that 360-degree view, then that's really good evidence. But then on top of that, when we're doing exercising and testing, again, that adds to it. What I would caveat and say is part of the reason I'm working on certification and scoring is because this idea of evidence and making it easy for people to prove that they're doing things well. We're also of a mind that we have to not just trust people's good word, but that's why we are busy training surveyors, that's why we are busy training assessors, with the idea that once work has been done, it can then be, as part of the code of practice, gone out and assessed, so that people can get a declaration that what is said has been done has actually been done. The proof of the pudding, though, is in the eating, and what I would say is, as we've had more and more properties who've been through the resilience journey subsequently have flooding, it's been brilliant. And businesses, particularly up in Cumbria, which seems to hit the headlines every 6 months, we have businesses that formerly had a metre of water, either have no water or what we call a carpet wetter, where they literally just wash down and off they go again. And so ultimately, we're on a journey with insurers, with all of us, of doing good work, getting it done, getting evidence in place. When floods do happen, that is when people know it really, really works, and we're building up that story. One of my good friends, Mary Dono, who sits on the round table, she's got a marvellous book that anyone can see, which is literally tens of case studies of where businesses and homes have done the resilience thing. And that has been very much useful, I think, for different insurers to then begin trusting that it really works in practice and not just theory.
Great, thanks, Bev. There's a question on the system from Jide about what kind of information should boards be looking at in respect of climate change impact on their organisations? So what sort of management information should we be presenting to our seniors?
Sorry, James, would you ask the question again? I got distracted by Amanda Harris's question on suppliers.
I'll come to that one next. Yeah, so what the question is, what kind of information should boards be looking at in respect of climate change impact on the organisation?
So in terms of the way that we're doing it, it's a mixture of quantitative and qualitative. And so the kinds of ESG reports that we're talking about have both of those different elements to it. Some of it, there'll be numeric calculations sitting behind things like how you manage your energy efficiency, but there is a very detailed set of different factors that need to be worked into that. If you've ever looked at some of the scoring mechanisms that are out there, like Thomson Reuters, there's more than 430 different categories that are used to assess a business for its environmental and climate friendliness and their ESG performance. So I'm not necessarily saying you need to do 430, but there are a certain set of categories that fit into the ERM framework very nicely that can then be packaged into, I think it's becoming increasingly accepted set of criteria that are being judged on the basis of.
Thank you. Well, let's go to Amanda's question now about supply chain then. I think this is a really big issue for a lot of organisations. We have seen through our experiences of COVID that we just simply don't know enough about the detail of our supply chains and where the vulnerabilities lie. I know a lot of organisations found that they had major vulnerabilities, not within their tier 1 or even tier 2, it was in their suppliers that caused them disruption when China in particular first went into lockdown back in January and February. So the question here is that our main risk in relation to climate will be in the supply chain. Is there an easy questionnaire that we can get them to complete to give us some confidence over their resilience?
So I'm going to split the answer into two. There's the physical element and then there's the transition element. So for the physical element, yes, just if you wanted to have a survey, pop onto the website, because we've done a physical survey that's exactly that. It talks about people's level of physical flood risk, what measures they've taken, if there are any resilience actions that they've done. And you could very easily have any one of your suppliers just fill that out and then you can judge them. The other piece, which I think is a little bit harder, is perhaps the transition risk. And when it comes to that, I work with our sister company, Oliver Wyman, who are the transition risk experts. And I think it's a good question. I don't know if there is an easy questionnaire for transition risk. I know when we're working with the different banks and financial institutions, actually unpicking the different effects of transition risk on a business can be quite complicated. So I'm going to answer that as I don't know, but I need to go away and find out.
There are some models that we can use from other resilience-related discussions with suppliers. Most organisations will ask through their procurement processes some form of questions around the presence of and quality of business continuity arrangements. I think there is some precedent there that you can build upon. Look, Bev, thank you very much for your time. I think we're going to draw it to a close there. Thanks everybody for taking part in the Spot the Difference and for the Q&A session.